Hello and welcome to this video looking at the role of foreign government in development. So in this video we're going to look not at the particular developing country in question's government, but looking at the role of foreign governments and the strategies they might use to help encourage growth and development in a developing country. So the first strategy we're going to look at is giving aid. This little chart here on the top left shows us the donor countries in blue, those who give aid, and the recipients in red. So aid spending in real terms has increased steadily in the past 50 years, rising to about 135 billion in 2013. But to put this into some sort of perspective, global military spending in 2010 was $1,630 billion. Again, the value of trade far outweighs aid by quite a large multiple. Having said that, a number of countries do give aid. So by aid, we mean giving money to developing country governments, or maybe giving it to organizations who try and do projects in particular countries. The largest aid givers are the United States, Germany, UK, France, and Japan. South Korea, China, and India are now also significant donor nations within the international community. There is a UN target that 0.7% of GNI should be given as aid, but very few countries meet this target. There are many forms that aid might take. So bilateral aid is straight from one country's government to another. It might be multilateral through some international organizations. It might be specifically for a particular project, provide technical assistance. Maybe aid we most traditionally think about it in terms of humanitarian, so some sort of disaster or a famine. Sometimes it can be made as a very sort of soft loan, and sometimes it can be tied. It can be aid, it's very specific requirements. You have to use this supplier to do this project in this country. A final form of aid is kind of giving money against debts that might be already known, which we call debt relief, but we'll talk about that later. So this is a list here of countries, and the percentage column here shows you the percentage of GNI, that gross national income, that's made up from receiving aid. So these countries here, 20% and above, have quite a significant source of income is aid in their country. So we mentioned earlier the biggest countries in terms of generators that were giving aid. We could say USA, UK, Germany, Japan, and France. But also other countries like Sweden, Netherlands, Canada, Norway, Italy, and Switzerland. Of course, this is not per capita, this is just in total. Where does this money go to? Well, for example, these are the 10 biggest recipients of foreign aid from the UK. Sort of the benefits of this, these aid flows. Well, we've mentioned previously one of the issues for many developing countries is the savings gap, and so this can plug that. Aid can provide money to finance long-term health and education projects. Aid can also fast forward investment in infrastructure that can be difficult to finance. It's estimated that well-targeted aid can add around 0.5% to a country's growth rate. Having said that, there are a lot of criticisms of aid. So one of them is to do with poor governance. Aid can be expropriated and leaves the recipient country. So we often see that aid is well intentioned, but then it goes through a lot of these organizations who all take some of the finance before it really reaches those who actually need it. There's maybe again a lack of transparency. Where does this money really go when it goes through aid consultants and non-governmental organizations? One criticism is that by giving aid to these countries, we create a dependency culture. So it might stunt entrepreneurial activity, or it might mean that the country becomes reliant upon it. And in fact, there's a disincentive to develop, because then you know that you're going to receive less aid. So overall, does aid really work? Well, aid can be quite a broad term here. There's quite a wide range of economic, social, environmental, and objectives, political objectives that it might have. And we've seen many examples of economic development taking place without aid, where we look at China and Vietnam, for example. They both sustained significant growth without receiving much in the way of aid. Having said that, well-directed and targeted aid can enhance growth potential, but again, it's maybe hard to see the effects in the short term. Ultimately, different kinds of aid projects can affect growth at different times and to different degrees. So context is very important. Okay, the second strategy foreign governments might use is debt relief. What we've seen is that many countries, and here's an example of these countries, have a lot of external debt owned to foreign companies or foreign banks, and this is compared as a percentage of their gross national income. And so debt relief is cancelling some of the government debt that is owed, so it could be partial or total forgiveness of debt, or they're trying to slow down or stop debt growth. External debt is owed by governments, households, businesses in a country to external overseas creditors. Some examples here are government bonds and private sector loans. Often the key issue is the cost of servicing the debt, so paying the interest each year, which puts a drain on a government's resources. So for example, in 2014, Ukraine's interest payments were 25% of their gross national income, or nearly 30% of the annual value of their exports. And so we have this idea that sometime for every dollar that a developing country receives in terms of maybe FDI or aid, they might be losing a lot more through paying interest and money that's capital flight and things like that. So this map of Africa on the right hand side shows us government debt as a percentage of GDP, and we can see the darker red countries are those that are have higher levels of debt compared to the size of their economy. We have seen that over time in sub-Saharan Africa there have been a few initiatives to reduce debt relief, particularly a Drop the Debt campaign in the mid-noughties, a multilateral debt relief effort here that you can see actually does reduce the level of debt indebtedness in many countries by quite a significant amount. So this campaign, Drop the Debt, Make Poverty History, did get some support. So the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative was initiated by the World Bank to try and give debt relief to return external debts to less than 150% of the value of a country's annual imports. An example here is the Ivory Coast, who were granted external debt relief of $7.7 billion, and the stock of Ivory Coast government debt decreased from 69% of GDP to 40% of GDP in 2012. Often this is introduced alongside some structural reforms, so you might say you can have this debt relief if you address these other areas in your economy. Now we're going to look at fair trade schemes. So fair trade movement covers 650 producer organisations in more than 60 countries. So essentially what fair trade is, as part of the Fair Trade Foundation, is about vetting companies to see whether their suppliers get a fair wage and are treated properly. If they are, then they can label their products under the fair trade badge. The idea is this improves the incomes for workers in developing countries. Some of the benefits of fair trade: it guarantees a higher price to certified producers, gives them greater price stability, can improve production standards. Sometimes even a premium price can be offered, which can be used a premium price can be associated with a fair trade scheme for sellers if they have invested in improving businesses and the communities that they buy from. However, there are some criticisms of fair trade. By buying from a fair trade source, you're not buying from someone who hasn't part of the Fair Trade Foundation. A large part of the premium price goes to processors and distributors rather than just the farmers themselves. You might still argue they don't actually get that much. We might also argue that fair trade does not address the fundamental cause of poverty. Greater investment needs to be made in economic reforms in order to have a lasting impact. Some free market economists believe that this distorts markets and actually creates an incentive to produce excess supply in those industries that have fair trade accreditation. Foreign governments may also enter into trade deals with developing countries to help growth and development. So a bilateral trade deal is one between two countries. So it might be between a developing country and a developed country. And this allows the developing economies, businesses to grow, benefit from economies of scale, and importantly have access to wealthy developed economy markets, where often they cannot compete with the heavily subsidized developed economy companies, particularly in agriculture when we think about the EU's common agricultural policy. However, developed countries often have skilled negotiators who seek to create deals that favour the developed country. So in this video, we've looked at the relationship between foreign governments and developing countries, and in particular the role that foreign governments might play in helping these countries to grow and develop. That's it. Thanks very much for listening.